Over a century since World War I concluded, unexploded munitions from that conflict continue to take lives. We're referring to hundreds of millions of these faulty explosives still hidden in the soil, leftovers from a massive barrage exceeding 1.5 billion shells. The volume was staggering enough to send even the rats in the trenches into frenzy. Artillery inflicted 70% of all injuries and deaths during the First World War. Here we'll examine how this occurred, the impact of various shell varieties on human anatomy, and the lasting changes faced by numerous survivors who made it through the ordeal. Surprisingly, the origins of artillery trace back to ancient Chinese alchemists pursuing an immortality potion. They didn't achieve that goal, yet they discovered that mixing saltpeter, sulfur and charcoal produced a potent explosive. The initial devices employing this mixture emerged around the year 1000 as fire lances, essentially spears fitted with bamboo or metal tubes that spewed fire and fragments when loaded with gunpowder. These primitive fire lances function much like short-range flamethrowers, effective up to roughly 3 meters. Hardly the image of conventional artillery today, but it marked the starting point. Over the following centuries, fire lances evolved into proper metal-barreled guns, with China's earliest genuine cannons making their debut. These weapons expanded in size and potency. During the medieval era, bombards transformed into enormous siege engines, some tipping the scales at more than 20 tons, crafted to demolish castle defences using spherical stone shots. Throughout history, artillery advanced at an accelerating pace. To avoid dwelling on every developmental stage, since your interest lies in its role in claiming 70% of World War I soldiers' lives, suffice it to note that the true breakthrough arrived in the 1850s via rifled barrels and breech-loading designs, which vastly enhanced precision and distance. Then the French unveiled a game-changer. Their 75mm field gun stood as the inaugural fully modern artillery system, reshaping battlefield tactics through its hydropneumatic recoil mechanism. Prior to this innovation, guns recoiled wildly upon firing, forcing crews to reposition after each round. The French 75 overcame that by allowing the barrel to glide rearward on rollers while the base stayed put. A hydraulic buffer dissipated the energy, comparable to halting a car speeding at 100 miles per hour in just 3 feet. And compressed air gently reset the barrel, enabling near-instant readiness for the next shot. This permitted a rate of 15 to 30 rounds per minute, a far cry from the 1 or 2 shots of earlier non-hydraulic pieces, highlighting the leap forward. Upon its introduction, nothing matched this fluid operation for at least a decade more. The French guarded the recoil tech as a national secret, distributing component manufacturing across the country, so only final assemblers grasped the full design. It rendered Germany's primary field guns obsolete in an instant. Deployed en masse, the 75mm elevated artillery from mere backup to the war's leading destroyer. By then, all global powers were racing to develop their own cutting-edge artillery, with Germany in a desperate sprint to outdo rivals ahead of conflict. Yet one critical oversight escaped notice. No one had trialled contemporary artillery in actual combat. Since Napoleon's time, European battles had involved quick clashes between elite forces. The assumption was that any future continental war would wrap up swiftly and conclusively, perhaps weeks or a few months tops. This miscalculation led to catastrophic offensives, dragging every faction into unprecedented trench stalemates and costing hundreds of thousands of lives. Thus, as hostilities erupted in August 1914, German forces breached Belgium's border, advancing toward Liège, the nation's key entry point. The city was shielded by 12 surrounding forts, engineered to endure assaults from 210mm guns. Then the biggest mobile artillery available. Belgian strategists figured these defences could resist for a full month, but the Germans brought an unfamiliar terror, a pair of experimental 420mm siege howitzers. Their existence was unknown to the Allies. Soon after the initial impacts, fortresses began falling one by one. Fort Lausanne crumbled when a lone 420mm round hit its ammo stores, sparking a colossal blast that wiped out 350 defenders and shattered the structure. What was meant to stall invaders for 30 days collapsed in merely 11. The pattern repeated at Namur, where massive German Big Berthas, alongside Austrian Skoda, 300 5mm mortars pounded the stronghold into submission within 4 days. Fortifications requiring years of construction and costing enormous vast sums of cash vanished in mere hours. The Germans demonstrated that no stronghold could withstand their massive guns, reshaping defensive strategies for the duration of the conflict. At the same time, in field engagements, cannon fire was just as pivotal, yet it favoured the defenders instead. In the Battle of the Frontiers, French troops pushed forward in tight groups. German forces held firm on elevated terrain, spotting enemy locations and raining destruction with their barrages. The French relied on their favoured 75mm field pieces for close-range shooting instead of long-distance aid, exposing operators and squandering their capabilities. German batteries perched on crests out of sight from French spotters, pounding away unanswered. On August 22, 1914, France endured its deadliest day ever, losing 27,000 men in a single day. The emphasis on aggressive zeal and swift-foot charges over gunpowder in French tactics turned out to be a fatal error against contemporary arms. Then an odd shift occurred. Cannons and automatic weapons rendered surface advances so lethal that soldiers burrowed below. Each army focused on shielding its personnel by excavating into the soil. What followed were repeated efforts by opponents to bypass one another's edges. Whenever one force attempted to curve around the foe's side, the rival stretched out to counter. And wherever they clashed, the holding army entrenched, while the assaulters failed to pierce. This pattern persisted until the pursuit halted at the sea, with no space left for manoeuvres. Initial shallow foxholes evolved into complex networks under escalating bombardment. Ultimately, a continuous barrier of ditches spanned roughly 450 miles. The quick victory, all anticipated by Christmas, morphed into an unprecedented deadlock. A vast blockade where guns dominated and progress crept in feet, not leagues. All that relentless shooting exposed an unforeseen issue. Wartime reserves of 1,000 to 1,500 shells per piece were meant to endure about 6 months. In reality, they depleted in mere weeks. Rapid-firing artillery unleashed 15 to 30 shots a minute, so one piece could burn through a full quota in an hour of intense combat. Soon, every great nation imposed ammo limits. British cannons got mere handfuls daily, occasionally only 6. The ammo shortage stemmed from forces consuming supplies at unimaginable speeds. Reserves brimmed with incompatible calibers, and plants couldn't meet the surge. Consequently, whole industries retooled to sustain the barrage. France ramped up from 20,000 shells daily to 100,000 by 1915. Germany's output swelled over 30 times monthly by 1918. Britain's yearly total jumped from 500,000 to more than 70 million. With males locked in deadly stalemates, by mid-war, females crafted British arms and munitions. These _one_toiled 12-hour days amid hazardous materials, and scores perished from mishaps or poisoning. The struggle evolved into an economic showdown as well as a battlefield one. Returning to the ditches, consider how guns operated in reality and why they revolutionised everything. Primarily, sinking barrages with foot soldiers remained an unsolvable headache throughout. Landlines sufficed for holding positions, but in assaults, runners alone relayed calls for aid, often delaying hours, if they made it back. Cables snapped under blasts and wireless tech was nascent and spotty in chaos. Thus, when troops charged, gunners shot without sight, blind to ground developments. Spotters in or by forward lines watched impacts and relayed adjustments via phone if lines held. Yet deeper penetration strained the setup, as watchers lagged while linking to units. Cable teams laboured amid fire to restore connections. Aero balloons hovered miles rearward at over 3,000 feet. Equipped with top optics, they scanned up to 11 miles, linked by wire for instant tweaks. But hydrogen-filled, they drew fighter planes like magnets. Balloon watchers were known as BAL lunatics, who served in one of the war's riskiest roles, yet they were equipped with parachutes, unlike the era's airplane pilots. In 116 jumps by Americans, every parachute deployed successfully. By 1918, planes had become the primary method for collecting data to direct artillery fire. Pilots conducted visual scouting, took photos to chart enemy locations, and used radio to send immediate adjustments, while releasing smoke flares over objectives to help gun crews determine distances. Yet there was an invisible conflict that escaped most soldiers' notice: the lethal duel between opposing artillery units. This counter-battery struggle formed a battle inside the battle, with countless lives hanging in the balance. The objective was to neutralise the foe's cannons and their crews. Locating enemy guns ahead of any assault was essential, and since they hid behind the lines, innovative tactics emerged. One of the war's smartest inventions was sound ranging. Mostly created by British experts, it used a series of outposts with microphones to capture the intensity and angle of sound waves from firing enemy artillery. An array of 6 or more stations picked up the deep rumble of the guns. By analysing slight timing variations in when each post detected the noise, experts pinpointed the weapon's precise spot. Come 1918, multiple guns could be identified at once just minutes after their initial blasts. The Germans, in contrast, used a far simpler approach with people holding stopwatches, leaving them at a clear disadvantage. Flash spotting relied on the muzzle flash from shots to reveal gun positions. Its value waned once the Germans adopted smokeless propellants in 1917, but sound ranging stayed crucial right through the end. Shifting to the ammunition itself, various shell types served distinct purposes. High explosive rounds contained powerful charges inside sturdy steel casings, which shattered into lethal shrapnel fragments that scattered across wide areas upon explosion. Initial HE shells featured delayed fuses, allowing them to dig into the soil before detonating. A good way to wreck bunkers, though it wasted much of the force in the dirt. Eventually, impact fuses were introduced, triggering blasts instantly on contact with any object, which proved better at slicing through wire obstacles. Shrapnel rounds took their name from Lieutenant General Henry Shrapnel, the late 18th century innovator behind their concept. These were empty steel casings packed with 200 to 500 lead or steel bullets, plus a powder charge ignited by preset time fuses. If timed correctly, the shell would rupture mid-air over advancing troops, hurling the bullets ahead at the projectile's full speed, like an aerial shotgun barrage. They worked well against exposed infantry, but failed against dug-in defences or covered spots. Gas shells introduced an entirely new kind of terror. Following trials with chlorine released from tanks, which relied too much on favourable winds, artillery delivery of chemicals was conceived. This escalated the horrors of World War I, enabling accurate strikes with poison anywhere, anytime. France debuted gas shells in mid-1916, adapting explosive casings to carry chemical agents, and Germany soon matched them. The Germans created a marking scheme for their toxic rounds, green crosses for lung-damaging substances like chlorine and phosgene, white crosses for irritants like tear gas, blue crosses for agents that clogged masks, compelling troops to take them off, and yellow crosses for mustard gas. Phosgene was 18 times deadlier than chlorine, accounting for roughly 85% of gas fatalities, with effects that might not show for up to 48 hours, often dooming soldiers unaware of their fatal exposure. Mustard gas, despite its name, was an oily liquid that vaporized into a mist, inflicting burns, blisters, and temporary blindness aimed more at incapacitating than outright killing. Enduring regular shelling, gruesome as it was, started to seem better than facing these chemical barrages. By the 1918 ceasefire, such shells formed a major share of every army's stockpiles. For deeper insights into these agents' impacts on people and their battlefield applications, check out our dedicated video on World War I chemical warfare next. Star shells burst high up, releasing a magnesium light hung from a tiny parachute to illuminate the dark field, aiding in spotting enemy activity. Smoke shells paired with gas and HE types to obscure views for the opponent's observers and gunners, especially useful in offensive pushes. The Germans and Austrians also deployed concrete-piercing shells, with time engineers crafted delay fuses for their massive siege guns, built to pierce fortified strongholds and detonate deep within. Yet one aspect rarely highlighted is the severe issue of dud shells plaguing the conflict. Figures indicate that around 30% of projectiles launched during the Somme initial barrage didn't detonate. Causes ranged from defective fuses and hasty manufacturing flaws to poor handling at the front lines. Relying heavily on shrapnel rounds, which proved ineffective against underground bunkers, combined with such high failure rates, left German positions mostly unscathed amid the enormous shelling. We'll revisit those unexploded ordnance pieces soon. Their lingering presence underground forms a separate chapter. Shifting focus, consider the strategies that developed amid this overwhelming ordnance. Early on, French and British forces relied on extended barrages prior to infantry charges, aiming to annihilate enemy strongpoints entirely. The 7-day onslaught kicking off the Battle of the Somme epitomized this method. The idea held that guns must pulverize foes into utter disarray before sending in Allied troops. However, these huge pre-assault volleys telegraphed the impending strike's location, cratered the terrain troops needed to traverse, and frequently missed deeply buried defenders who hunkered down in reinforced shelters until the storm passed. In contrast, Germans opted for a more integrated style, coordinating barrages precisely with advancing soldiers to suppress opposition briefly enough for breakthroughs. While Allied setups in 1917 often dragged on for a full week or longer, German ones wrapped up in mere hours, yielding superior results. They leaned on chemical and obscuring rounds to hinder and confuse, without scarring the earth their own forces would navigate. A key breakthrough was ditching preliminary ranging shots. Earlier, gunners had to test fire for accuracy, revealing their spots and alerting adversaries. Instead, Germans devised computational methods, factoring in precise weather data and individual barrel traits to forecast adjustments. Executed well, this enabled pinpoint strikes sans any telltale previews. Operation Michael's opening assault in March 1918 unleashed 3.5 million rounds over 5 hours, nearly 200 per second, with Teutonic batteries catching everyone off guard. Interestingly, the British were pioneering comparable advances, and certain scholars contend they outpaced the Germans by years in these refinements. To bridge the gap between spotters and foot soldiers, they programmed forward fire shifts on fixed timelines. This progressed into the rolling barrage, a moving shield of explosions right in front of pushing riflemen, creeping ahead at set speeds, usually 50 metres each minute. At designated moments, clusters of cannons hammered a front line. Then, after a fixed interval, the barrage leaped to the subsequent line. Assault teams drilled to trail this advancing barrier of their own fire, matching its rhythm regardless of conditions. Still, the rolling barrage locked infantry rigidly to the gunner's blueprint. No flexibility if plans derailed. The barrage's steady pace frequently surged beyond burdened soldiers slogging over blasted earth, giving enemy holdouts chances to scramble out and counter once the shells moved on. French commanders deemed 10% friendly losses tolerable for troops hugging within 50 yards of bursting rounds during such advances. Pause to let that sink in. Speaking of French artillery ordeals, Verdun demands mention. February 21, 1916, saw 1,400 German pieces crammed along an 8-mile sector unleash over 1 million shells across 9 hours. What ensued? 10 months of the war's fiercest clashes. Both armies poured reinforcements into a relentless churn of barrages and brutal infantry scraps, claiming or maiming over 700,000 lives total. The terrain morphed into a desolate waste of interlocking craters. Endless shelling prevented body retrievals, forcing fighters to battle amid decaying fellow soldiers. Then came Third Ypres, Passchendaele by another name, illustrating how colossal barrages could backfire catastrophically. Over 3,000 guns hurled 4.5 million shells in 10 days of prep, obliterating the irrigation networks that prevented Flanders lowlands from waterlogging. When downpours hit, the zone dissolved into quagmire, troops submerged to their hips. Horses, supplies, tanks ended up completely submerged in the mud. Moving artillery ahead was impossible, as the cannons burrowed even deeper into the ground with every discharge. The British pushed forward approximately 5 miles, but paid a heavy price with more than 250,000 wounded or killed. During the Battle of Amiens in August 1918, British forces had mastered integrating foot soldiers' charges with chemical weapons, cannon fire, armoured vehicles, and planes in a unified offensive. Allied troops stayed right on the heels of the advancing curtain of shells, while tanks smashed through barbed wire and knocked out machine gun nests. Planes raked the enemy lines with gunfire and targeted their logistics routes with explosives. Prior to the assault, gun teams relied on observations from the air, acoustic detection, and visual spotting of flashes to pinpoint German batteries. Numerous enemy cannons were neutralized before the soldiers even climbed out of their trenches. Rather than a drawn-out initial barrage that would alert the foe, the shelling erupted abruptly and accurately, synchronized perfectly to aid every phase of the push. In 1914, cannon tactics resembled those from Napoleon's time. Yet by 1918, cutting-edge artillery had fully emerged. Now, we'll examine some of the war's standout pieces of ordnance, beginning with the enormous German howitzers that stunned everyone at the start. The Krupp 420mm M Gerät, known as Dicky Bertha or Big Bertha, served as Germany's ultimate heavy siege gun. It launched projectiles exceeding 800 kilograms over distances beyond 9 kilometers, demanding roughly 200 personnel for setup, movement, and firing. Putting it together took around 6 hours in perfect circumstances, and its impacts created holes 6 meters deep and 9 meters across. The Paris gun represented a radical test in extreme distance firing. Featuring a 37-meter barrel and weighing 138 tons, it struck targets up to 130 kilometers away, soaring to heights above 42 kilometers, the record until V-2 missiles in the following conflict. Those rounds pierced the stratosphere, encountering minimal drag, which meant gunners had to factor in the Coriolis force from the planet's spin for their calculations. It functioned more as a psychological terror tool than a reliable battlefield asset. The Austro-Hungarian Skoda 305mm mortar, called Lanky Emma, packed less punch than Big Bertha, but was far easier to position, ready for action nearly anywhere in about 50 minutes. Unlike Big Bertha, which needed railway tracks, it could punch through 2 meters of armoured concrete, and Germany borrowed 8 units to pair with their larger calibers. At the opposite extreme, trench mortars arose from the demand for portable arms that foot soldiers could haul into the front lines against spots hidden from rear area big guns. The British Stokes mortar stood out for its elegant simplicity. It disassembled into 3 components, tipping the scales at a mere 108 pounds altogether, with a useful reach of about 800 yards, and skilled operators could unleash as many as 30 shots a minute using just 2 men. This design inspired nearly every infantry mortar used today. When the United States joined the fight, it sorely lacked up-to-date artillery. Pershing's troops mostly relied on French and British equipment, with the French 75mm becoming the main US field piece. Next, we'll explore the realities of serving on an artillery team. Even though they stayed distant from the frontline nightmares, their work brought plenty of its own hardships. Days kicked off with pre-dawn preparations, then targeting missions where sections of hostile positions were designated for demolition. In intense campaigns, units could loose 800 to 1,000 shells daily, pausing every 4 hours for breaks, given the grueling labour. Ammo wasn't lightweight, and handlers wrestled it non-stop. Teams endured relentless quick barrages leading to burnout, harsh weather in exposed dugouts, perpetual din harming their ears, and no rest amid prolonged shellings that ran for days without stop, like the week-long prep for the Somme, firing around the clock. The biggest danger for gun handlers was counter-battery fire, as foes zeroed in on active positions and unleashed revenge strikes. Poison gas posed special risks, since masks hampered speedy gun service and contaminated zones lingered for hours or longer. Faulty rounds sometimes detonated prematurely inside the tubes, wrecking weapons and personnel, while a direct hit on stacked munitions could wipe out the whole supply. Harsh as conditions were for the artillerymen, those enduring the onslaught fared far worse. A German infantryman at the Somme recounted non-stop shelling around the clock. Projectiles of all sizes rained down without mercy. Their underground shelters collapsed, burying them alive, forcing survivors to claw free themselves and their buddies. Some they uncovered were choked to death, others crushed beyond recognition. Troops hunkered in the bunkers grew frantic, desperate to bolt outside. Comrades had to restrain them physically, holding them in the relative security of the deep burrows. Even the rats went mad, swarming into those makeshift havens in search of safety. Intense artillery barrages left soldiers with no food or water, as shells kept exploding relentlessly around them. Veterans could identify various weapons by their unique noises. The term .4 was slang for shells from the German 77mm field gun, which moved quicker than sound. So troops heard the whistle of the incoming projectile right before the distant boom from the cannon, offering almost no chance to react. .5 described the puff of smoke and flash from any large German high-explosive round. Gas projectiles typically made a softer, telltale pop on impact, something soldiers drilled to spot immediately. To counter this, attackers often blended gas shells with regular high-explosive ones, masking the sound and catching men off guard before they could don their masks. The sheer unpredictability of fatalities took a heavy toll on morale. Someone might endure dozens of close calls only to die from a single shell striking the precise wrong place at the worst instant. This ties directly into the video's main question. Given the massive volume of shells unleashed and the non-stop nature of the pounding, it's clear now why artillery claimed so many lives. Yet the barrage inflicted several profoundly gruesome effects on the body that deserve discussion. For starters, injuries from shells differed starkly from those of rifle rounds. Artillery accounted for 60 to 70% of all combat deaths in World War I. Shrapnel pieces mangled entire limbs, leading to massive bleeding. Scorching metal shards ripped through skin, leaving jagged tears or stripping away faces completely. Some perished purely from the shockwave, their internal organs ruptured without a visible external wound. Being entombed alive happened all too often, with blasts unearthing fresh graves while entombing others under dirt. In 2018, excavators uncovered the skeletons of 21 German troops in a bunker, crushed when an Allied shell detonated overhead. They remained seated on benches or stretched out, just as they were when the collapse hit. Throughout the conflict, Germany carried out about 67,000 amputations, while Britain managed around 41,000. These surgeries became necessary after shrapnel shredded extremities, or when machine gun fire pulverized bones irreparably. On the Western Front's manure-rich farmland, gangrene from soil bacteria released deadly poisons, rapidly rotting tissue, and often forcing limb removal as the sole remedy. Trench combat spiked facial disfigurements as heads popping above the edge drew shrapnel fire. Even without a direct hit, another widespread affliction struck more than 250,000 troops: shell shock, manifesting as involuntary tremors, speech loss, limb paralysis, recurring terrors, insomnia, gait issues, psychosomatic blindness, and sudden fits of terror. A British doctor first used the phrase in 1915. Initially, medics attributed it to direct blast damage to nerves. Over time, however, it emerged that those far from explosions could suffer identically from the endless dread of sustained shelling. By 1917, the British military outlawed shell shock as an official diagnosis, suppressing reports even in medical publications due to skyrocketing cases. At the Somme, 40% of British losses involved shell shock, sparking a crisis that threatened to cripple the force. Frontline remedies consisted of short breaks at aid posts, near enough to catch the thunder of guns, plus rest, meals, calming drugs, and generous tots of rum. Hardly modern therapy by today's standards. Recall the dud statistics from before. Roughly 1 in 4 shells on the Western Front failed to go off, and with some 1.5 billion rounds launched in total, that left hundreds of millions buried, unexploded. In present-day France, experts in bomb disposal retrieve about 900 tons of such relics annually. The yield remains consistent, and clearance is far from over. Routine farming, ditch digging, building projects, or amateur excavations can jostle a device enough to trigger its decayed fuse after a century underground. Deadly mishaps persist. Failed gas munitions might crack open, seep or vaporize old chemicals. Mustard gas especially can sear flesh and airways over a century on. Regarding artillery doctrine, the hard-won insights from the war influenced its role globally through the 20th century. It proved indispensable and evolved into an even more lethal force in future conflicts.